The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a white cane against the sterile linoleum was the only sound in the hallway, until it wasn't. Ethan Walker, a former Army sergeant who traded his peripheral vision for a Purple Heart 3 years ago, stopped dead. From Kennel 4, a sound erupted that would have sent a civilian running. A guttural, bone-chilling roar that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of Ethan's boots. This wasn't the bark of a pet. It was the war cry of a Thor, a 90-pound German shepherd whose service record was as decorated and as bloody as Ethan's own. Thor was a relic of the elite K9 units, trained for high-stakes apprehension and IED detection. But since his handler was Kia during a routine patrol, the dog had turned. The staff saw a monster slated for permanent isolation. Ethan, standing in his weathered M65 field jacket, saw a mirror. While the handlers reached for their tranquilizer poles, Ethan felt a pull he couldn't explain. He didn't hear a threat. He heard the frantic, jagged rhythm of a soldier who had been left behind in the dark. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. "He's a killer, Sergeant," one of the handlers warned, his voice tight with the kind of fear that dogs like Thor fed on. The facility staff, uniform in their bright yellow shirts, formed a semicircle of caution around Kennel 4. They saw the liability protocol on 4 legs. They saw a dog that had already retired 2 veteran handlers and nearly snapped the radius of a third. Ethan didn't flinch. He adjusted his dark shades, his heightened senses mapping the room. He could smell the ozone of the cooling system, the metallic tang of the galvanized steel bars, and beneath it all, the scent of Thor. It wasn't just the scent of an animal, it was the faint, lingering aroma of CLP gun oil and desert dust. Scents that had no business being in a civilian rehab center in 2026. "I'm not looking for a guide dog," Ethan murmured, his fingers tightening on the red grip of his cane. "I'm looking for someone who knows why the world feels like a minefield." Karen, the facility director, hesitated. Thor was top tier. Elite tracking, explosive detection, he saved dozens of lives before his breakdown. But he's unpredictable now. He's territorial, aggressive, and frankly, he's dangerous to be near. As if to prove her point, Thor lunged. The sound of 400 psi of jaw pressure snapping against the steel echoed like a gunshot. The handlers moved in, but Ethan stepped forward. He reached out, not to touch but to listen. In the microsecond of silence between Thor's barks, Ethan heard it, a sharp, hitching inhale. It was the sound of a predator recognizing a familiar frequency. Thor didn't bark again. He began to pace, his claws clicking against the concrete in a frantic, desperate rhythm. He wasn't trying to break out to attack. He was trying to reach the only person in 3 years who carried the scent of the front lines. Little did they know, within the hour, a mechanical failure in the facility's HVAC and security override system would turn this kennel into a kill zone, and the monster in Kennel 4 would be the only one capable of leading the blind soldier through the smoke. The world had been a mosaic of shadows and sharp edges for Ethan Walker since a humid Tuesday in 2023, just outside a dusty village near the Kunar province. The blast from the directional IED hadn't just taken his sight. It had stripped away the skin of his identity, leaving behind a man who felt more like a ghost haunting his own life. Now, standing in the sterile, echoing corridor of the K9 Rehabilitation Center, the ghost felt a sudden, violent spark of life. The air in the hallway was thick with the clinical scent of industrial-grade disinfectant and the underlying musk of high-strung animals. Ethan's boots, polished despite his blindness, clicked rhythmically against the floor, a sound mirrored by the steady tap of his white cane. He wore his old M65 field jacket, the fabric softened by years of use but still holding the faint, ghost scent of CLP, the gun oil he'd used to clean his M4 carbine through 3 deployments. It was a sensory anchor in a world of darkness. Beside him, Karen's footsteps were light, tentative. "We usually start our veterans with the labs or the Goldens, Ethan. They're bred for the temperament you'll need for a service animal. Calm, predictable, safe." Ethan didn't answer. He was tracking a different sound. Most of the dogs in the facility offered a chorus of needy whimpers or playful, bouncing barks. But from the far end of the wing, the high-security zone where the doors were reinforced with heavy-duty galvanized steel, came a sound that bypassed his ears and settled directly in his marrow. It was a low, resonant vibration that hummed through the concrete floor. It was the sound of a living engine of war. "What's in Kennel 4? Ethan asked, his voice a low gravel. Karen's pace slowed. "That's Thor. He's an outlier. A Belgian Malinois German Shepherd cross. He was part of an elite multi-purpose dog program, trained for everything from high-value target apprehension to detecting peroxide-based explosives. He's a specialized tool, Ethan. But he's broken. As they approached, the low hum escalated into a thunderous, bone-rattling snarl. It was a sound Ethan recognized from the dark corners of his memory, the sound of a creature that had seen too much and decided that the only defense was total offense. Ethan stopped directly in front of the bars. He could feel the heat radiating from the animal on the other side. Through his darkness, Ethan visualized the beast based on the frantic scrapings and the sheer volume of the roar. Thor would be a powerhouse of muscle, his coat likely a mix of sable and deep black. The dog slammed against the bars, the metal clanging with a force that would have made a lesser man recoil. To the handlers in their yellow shirts, Thor was a liability, a monster with a permanent isolation tag on his file. They saw the bared teeth, the flecks of foam, and the wild rolling eyes of a predator that had lost its mission. But Ethan, standing perfectly still, sensed something the others missed. He adjusted his dark shades, his head tilting slightly. He knew what it was like to be a specialized tool that the world no longer knew how to use. He knew the frustration of being discarded because the scars were on the inside. "He's not aggressive because he's mean, Karen," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the dog's fury. "He's aggressive because he's still waiting for a command that's never coming." The dog's snarl broke for a split second, replaced by a sharp, inquisitive huff of air. Thor's sensitive nose worked frantically, catching the scent of the M65 jacket, the scent of the motor pool, the firing range, and the specific, salt-heavy sweat of a man who had lived in the dirt. "He'll kill you if you get within reach, Ethan," a handler warned, his hand hovering over a CO2 fire extinguisher meant to break up fights. "He nearly took a man's hand off last week. He doesn't see a friend, he sees an intruder." Ethan didn't back away. Instead, he did something that caused a collective gasp from the staff. He reached out with his left hand, stopping just inches from the vibrating steel bars. He felt the hot, ragged breath of the dog against his skin. In that moment, the darkness of the veteran and the iron of the cage seemed to blur together. Ethan wasn't looking for a guide to help him cross the street. He was looking for a brother in arms to help him survive the peace. As the dog's growl deepened into a sound that felt like a warning of impending disaster, the facility's overhead lights flickered once, twice, and then plunged the hallway into a red-hued emergency glow. A mechanical whine began to rise from the ventilation shafts, and a heavy, metallic click echoed from the security doors at both ends of the hall. Ethan's brow furrowed. He didn't need sight to know that the rhythm of the building had just changed. The liability protocol was no longer a suggestion. It was about to become a cage for everyone inside. Just as Ethan prepared to speak, a low electronic voice crackled over the intercom, but it was drowned out by a sound much more terrifying. The hiss of a pressurized seal breaking somewhere deep in the red zone, and the sudden frantic whimpering of the dog who had just stopped snarling and started to push against the cage door with a desperate new urgency. Thor wasn't trying to get at Ethan anymore. He was trying to get out, and his eyes weren't fixed on the man. They were locked on the ceiling vent where a faint, greenish vapor was beginning to swirl. The greenish vapor curling from the overhead vents was nearly invisible in the dim emergency lighting, but Ethan Walker didn't need eyes to sense the sudden shift in the air's chemistry. Beside him, Karen's breathing hitched, the rhythmic stride of her professional composure fracturing into the staccato of rising panic. Around them, the high-security wing of the K9 facility had transformed into a pressurized tomb. The heavy electromagnetic locks on the reinforced steel doors had engaged with a final echoing thud, a safety feature of the building's 2026 automated containment system that was now threatening to become a death sentence. "Ethan, we have to move back," Karen choked out, her hand trembling as she gripped his arm. "The HVAC seal. Something is wrong. The sensors are flagging a chemical leak from the adjacent lab." But Ethan remained rooted to the spot, his attention locked on Kennel 4. Thor had stopped the violent lunging. The thunderous, bone-shaking barks had transitioned into something far more unsettling. A series of short, sharp huffs followed by a low, mournful whine that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of Ethan's bones. To the handlers scrambling for their gas masks and tranquilizer poles, it was just more erratic behavior from an unstable beast. To Ethan, it was a transmission in a language he had mastered in the valleys of the Hindu Kush. "He's not going crazy again, Karen," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a calm, commanding register that had once led men through fire. "Listen to the cadence. That isn't a predator looking for a kill. That's a sentry sounding the alarm." One of the handlers, a man named Miller who still clutched a heavy capture pole, stepped back as Thor slammed his shoulder against the cage. "He's a monster, Sergeant. He's trying to break the latch to get to us while we're trapped." Ethan turned his head toward the sound of Miller's voice, his dark glasses reflecting the flashing red emergency beacons. "You hear a monster because you're listening with fear. I hear a partner who's lost his team. In the Army we called it moral injury. When Thor's handler was killed by that IED in 24, the dog didn't just lose a master. He lost his internal compass. That bark? It's the same sound a man makes when he's screaming into the radio for a medevac that isn't coming. It's not rage. It's grief so heavy it has nowhere to go but out through his teeth." Thor let out a sharp, piercing yelp and began digging at the concrete floor with such ferocity that his claws threw sparks against the grit. Ethan reached out, his hand unerringly finding the cold, galvanized steel of the kennel door. He could feel the animal's frantic heartbeat through the metal. "He knows what that vapor is," Ethan continued, his voice steady even as the first tingle of the chemical irritant reached his own lungs. "He was trained for detection. He's smelling the breakdown of the fire suppression chemicals, likely a concentrated fluoroketone mix. It's heavier than air. It's going to settle on the floor first. He's not trying to attack us. He's trying to tell us that the floor is becoming a kill zone." Karen coughed, the sound wet and labored. "The override. The terminal is at the end of the hall, but the gas is too thick. We can't see the keypad." Ethan felt a grim smile touch his lips. The darkness he had lived in for 3 years was no longer a disability. It was an environment he owned. He felt Thor's wet nose press against the gap in the bars, the dog's breathing synchronizing with his own. The beast had gone silent, its powerful body coiled like a spring, waiting for the one thing it hadn't had in years, a directive. "I don't need to see the keypad," Ethan whispered, his fingers finding the heavy manual slide bolt of the kennel. "And he doesn't need to see the exit. He can smell the fresh air intake from 3 levels up." "Ethan, don't," Miller shouted, leveling the capture pole. "If you let him out now in this chaos, he'll tear us apart before the gas even touches us." Ethan's hand closed around the lever. He could feel Thor's heat, the raw power of a creature that had been bred for war and broken by loss. He knew that the moment he pulled this latch, he was either inviting his own execution or forging a bond that the world of the sighted could never understand. "He's not a monster," Ethan said, the metal lever groaning under his hand. "He's a soldier. And it's time he went back to work." As the bolt slid back with a definitive, metallic clack, the heavy door didn't swing open. Instead, Thor let out a sound that wasn't a bark or a growl, but a sharp, urgent command of his own. The dog's weight hit the door with the force of a battering ram, but he didn't head for the handlers. He turned his massive head toward Ethan's jacket, his teeth snagging the heavy canvas of the sleeve with surgical precision, pulling the veteran toward the thickening fog of the corridor. But as they stepped into the haze, a secondary alarm began to wail, a high-pitched rhythmic scream that signaled the final seal of the red zone, was about to drop a 3-ton blast door, sealing them inside with the leaking core. Thor froze, his ears pinning back as he looked not at the door, but at a narrow maintenance crawlspace that no human could navigate in time, and certainly not one who couldn't see the jagged edges of the opening. The screeching of the secondary alarm was a jagged blade cutting through the thick, chemical-laden air of the corridor. As the greenish mist of the fluoroketone suppressant swirled around Ethan's knees, the memories of Thor's violent history, the data points Karen had whispered with such trepidation, felt like a physical weight in the room. This wasn't just a dog with a behavioral issue. Thor was a living weapon whose safety had been disengaged by tragedy, and his ledger was already marked with the blood of those who had tried to play master. "Ethan, get back." Miller's voice was a panicked rasp from behind a tactical gas mask. "You don't know what he did. He's not just grieving, he's a primary aggression canine who lost his off switch." Ethan felt the vibration of Thor's powerful frame through the sleeve of his M65 jacket. The dog was a Belgian Malinois and German Shepherd cross, a lineage perfected for the military's multi-purpose roles, but Thor's specific history was darker than most. In late 2024, during a high-stakes narcotics and explosives sweep in the port of Long Beach, Thor's handler, Officer Marcus Vance, had been caught in a localized blast. Thor hadn't been injured by the shrapnel, but something in his wiring had snapped when he saw Vance fall. The reports Ethan had memorized were chilling. When the paramedics arrived to save Vance, Thor hadn't seen rescuers. He had seen threats to his fallen partner. He had defended Vance's body with a savage, uncompromising ferocity that left 2 EMTs with permanent nerve damage. Even after Vance was pronounced dead, Thor refused to leave the bedside at the morgue, eventually requiring a specialized tactical team and a high-dose sedative dart to neutralize him. Since that day, Thor hadn't been a police dog. He had been a prisoner of war. 6 months ago, a senior handler at this very facility had tried to use a standard dominant alpha approach to retrain him. Thor had responded with a lightning-fast redirection, his jaws, capable of exerting nearly 400 pounds of pressure, clamping onto the man's forearm and shattering the radius in 3 places before the man could even scream. Then there was the volunteer who had simply moved too fast with a leash. Thor had pinned her to the concrete, his teeth bared inches from her throat, his eyes filled with a terrifying cold vacuum where loyalty used to live. "He's an apex predator who thinks everyone is an insurgent," Miller shouted, his boots scuffing the floor as he retreated from the descending blast door. "He's attacked every person who's tried to help him because he thinks help is an ambush." Ethan stood his ground, the hot, ragged breath of the dog warming his hand. He understood why the world feared Thor. The dog was a relic of a violent purpose, a creature trained to bite and hold until the world stopped moving. But Ethan also knew that a weapon doesn't choose its target. It is aimed. Thor wasn't attacking out of malice. He was stuck in a final stand loop, defending a ghost that had been gone for 2 years. "He didn't attack those people because he's a monster, Miller," Ethan called out, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "He attacked them because they smelled like fear and looked like intruders. They tried to control him with iron and poles. You can't command a soldier who's still in the middle of a firefight." Thor's grip on Ethan's sleeve tightened, but it wasn't a bite. It was a guidance. The dog's ears flicked toward the ceiling, tracking the mechanical groan of the 3-ton blast door as it began its slow, inevitable descent. The exit was 50 feet away, but the gas was now a chest-high wall of poison, and the handlers were already fleeing toward the high ground of the mezzanine. Ethan felt Thor's body coil, a rhythmic twitching in the dog's haunches that signaled an imminent, explosive movement. The language of monsters was shifting again, moving from a warning to a tactical maneuver. Thor knew exactly how much time they had before the seals finalized and the oxygen was purged to starve the potential chemical fire. Suddenly, Thor released Ethan's sleeve and let out a single sharp bark that echoed like a 9mm round in the confined space. He didn't run for the door. Instead, he lunged toward a heavy, reinforced equipment locker bolted to the wall near the maintenance crawlspace. As the dog's claws tore at the metal, Ethan realized with a jolt of adrenaline that Thor wasn't looking for a way out for himself. The dog shoved his muzzle into a gap behind the locker, pulling out a discarded heavy-duty leather bite sleeve, and dropping it at Ethan's feet with a frantic whine. It wasn't just equipment, it was a tool from his past life, a signal of the one thing Ethan hadn't considered. As the blast door reached the halfway point, Thor didn't look at the exit. He looked at a specific blood-stained patch on Ethan's old military jacket, and his growl turned into a sound that was almost a plea. Ethan's hand reached down, his fingers brushing the bite sleeve and then the dog's scarred ears. "What are you showing me, Thor?" The dog didn't answer with a bark. He grabbed the leather sleeve and began dragging it toward the narrow, jagged opening of the ventilation shaft, an opening far too small for a man of Ethan's size to fit through. But as the green gas reached Ethan's throat, making him gag, he realized Thor wasn't trying to lead him through the hole. He was trying to get Ethan to give him something that had been locked away in a high-security vault since the day Officer Vance died. Ethan's fingers searched the dog's heavy tactical collar, feeling for a hidden compartment he'd heard rumored in elite K9 gear, a compartment that contained the only thing in the world that could settle Thor's rage, or end both of their lives in a final, violent misunderstanding. The green fluoroketone gas was no longer a mist. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against Ethan's lungs, tasting of bitter metal and imminent collapse. Above them, the blast door groaned, a relentless descent of 3 tons of steel that threatened to seal the hallway into a permanent tomb. Ethan's fingers, numbed by the cold and the adrenaline, fumbled along the thick nylon of Thor's tactical collar. He was searching for the last resort pouch, a standard-issue feature for elite K9 units in the mid-2020s, designed to hold a handler's final emergency contact and a scent relic for tracking. But as his hand brushed against Thor's neck, the dog didn't lunge. Thor froze, his massive chest heaving, his muzzle pressed deep into the fabric of Ethan's M65 field jacket. The snarl that had defined the beast for years vanished, replaced by a frantic rhythmic sniffing that sounded like a sob. Ethan felt the vibration of the dog's snout tracing the seams of the jacket, specifically the faded rectangular ghost of a patch on the right shoulder, the mark of the 10th Mountain Division. To a civilian, the jacket was just a weathered piece of surplus. But to an elite multi-purpose dog whose olfactory bulb was 40 times larger than a human's, the fabric was a library of historical trauma. Thor wasn't smelling the laundry detergent from Ethan's apartment. He was smelling the deep layered history embedded in the fibers. He was smelling the CLP, cleaner, lubricant, and preservative, used on M4 carbines in 2023. He was smelling the mineral-heavy dust of the Kunar province and the distinct acrid tang of composition B explosive residue that had permeated the cloth during the blast that took Ethan's sight. It was the scent of the unit. It was the scent of the war they had both survived and the one they had both brought home. "You know it, don't you?" Ethan whispered, his voice cracking as the gas burned his throat. "You don't smell a stranger. You smell the line." Thor let out a low, warbling whimper, a sound so human it made Ethan's heart seize. For 2 years, Thor had lived in a world of new scents: the sterile ammonia of the shelter, the cheap polyester of civilian clothes, and the scent of fear from people who viewed him as a broken tool. But here, in the darkness of a failing facility, he had found a scent that matched the one etched into his brain on the day Officer Vance fell. It was the smell of brotherhood, of duty, and of a shared history that transcended the species barrier. Through the red-tinted emergency light he could not see, Ethan felt a sudden, profound shift in the dog's energy. Thor's posture changed from defensive aggression to a focused, tactical alert. The dog moved from Ethan's side to his front, his powerful haunches coiling. He wasn't looking at the exit anymore. His ears were swiveling toward the ventilation shaft where the gas was thickest. "Thor, we're out of time," Ethan gasped, his knees buckling as the oxygen levels plummeted. The blast door was now only 3 feet from the floor. "If we don't move, we're gone." But Thor didn't run for the door. He turned back to Ethan, his teeth gently but firmly snagging the hem of the M65 jacket, pulling Ethan not toward the closing steel door, but toward the reinforced equipment locker he had been tearing at moments before. With a strength that seemed fueled by more than just muscle, the dog shoved his weight against the heavy locker, sliding it 6 inches to the left. Behind the locker wasn't just a wall. Ethan's hands searched the space Thor had cleared, his fingers meeting the cold, industrial mesh of a secondary air intake, one that bypassed the automated security seals. It was a narrow, jagged portal meant for maintenance drones, but as Ethan's hand passed through it, he felt a rush of clean, cold air. Thor let out a sharp, urgent bark, nudging Ethan's hand toward the intake. The dog knew they couldn't fit through together, and he knew the blast door would hit the floor in less than 30 seconds. He was offering Ethan a choice: save himself through the vent, or stay in the dark with a monster, as the air turned to poison. But as Ethan's fingers traced the edge of the mesh, he felt something else, something Thor had tucked into the gap earlier. It was a metal canister, small and cylindrical, and as Ethan pulled it out, he recognized the weight and the texture of a specialized M18 smoke grenade, likely a leftover from a tactical training exercise. Ethan's thumb found the pin, but as he did, he realized Thor wasn't looking at the vent anymore. The dog's hackles were raised higher than ever, and his head was snapped toward the opposite end of the hall, toward the safe mezzanine where the handlers were watching. Thor wasn't smelling the gas anymore. He had caught a new scent, a scent that shouldn't have been in a K9 facility, a scent that explained exactly why the accidental leak had happened in the first place. Ethan leaned closer to Thor's ear, the dog's fur soft against his cheek. "What do you hear, partner?" From the other side of the closing blast door, through the hiss of the gas, came a sound that made Ethan's blood turn colder than the air: the rhythmic, metallic clack-clack of a bolt being pulled back on an automatic weapon. The accident wasn't an accident, and the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the dog, it was whatever was waiting for the door to finish closing. The roar of the facility's emergency sirens had faded into a low, pulsating thrum, leaving the hallway in a heavy, expectant silence. The green fluoroketone gas continued its slow, serpentine crawl along the floor, but for a moment, the world narrowed down to the space between Ethan's outstretched hand and the iron bars of Kennel 4. Behind the blast door, the chilling clack-clack of a weapon being readied signaled that the threat from outside was no longer theoretical. Yet, the most immediate danger remained the 90-pound engine of muscle and trauma inches from Ethan's fingertips. "Ethan, don't. The protocol, you're going to lose that hand." Karen's voice was a desperate, muffled sob from further down the hall, her words catching in a throat already irritated by the chemical haze. Ethan didn't listen. In the army he had learned that protocols were built for the average man, and neither he nor the dog before him was average. He knew that the handlers viewed Thor as a malfunctioning piece of equipment, but Ethan felt the dog's heat, a living, breathing furnace of energy that was currently vibrating with a sound that wasn't a growl. It was a high-frequency whine, the kind of sound a dog makes when it recognizes a long-lost scent in a crowd of strangers. Against every regulation governing the K9 Rehabilitation Center, Ethan moved his hand past the threshold of the galvanized steel. His fingers moved slowly, telegraphing every inch of progress through the stagnant, toxic air. He wasn't reaching out to grab, he was reaching out to be known. The handlers froze, Miller's capture pole trembling in his grip. They expected the snap of bone, the 400 psi of jaw pressure that had shattered the last man's arm. Instead, they saw something that defied the facility's 3-year history of violence. Thor's massive head, scarred from a dozen tactical engagements and the shrapnel of the Long Beach blast, tilted into Ethan's palm. The dog didn't bite. He didn't even show his teeth. With a sound that was half whimper and half sigh, Thor pressed his wet nose into the center of Ethan's hand. The monster of Kennel 4 leaned his weight against the bars, seeking the contact of the man who carried the scent of the 10th Mountain Division and the acrid ghost of Composition B. It was the first time since Officer Vance had died in 2024 that Thor had allowed a human hand to touch him without the intervention of a sedative or a snare. Ethan's fingers curled into the thick, coarse fur of Thor's neck, finding the heavy tactical collar. "I've got you, brother," Ethan whispered, his voice steady even as his lungs burned. "I've got you." The connection was electric. Through the touch, Ethan felt the dog's pulse, rapid, tactical, but no longer chaotic. Thor's breathing slowed, matching the veteran's rhythmic, controlled exhales. In that shared moment of darkness, the blind soldier and the broken guardian became a single unit. The dog wasn't just tolerating the touch, he was leaning into it, grounding himself in the only thing that made sense in a world of shifting gases and armed threats. But the moment of peace was shattered by the final heavy thud of the blast door hitting the floor. The seal was complete. They were locked in the red zone, isolated from the handlers, with the oxygen sensors beginning to wail as the suppression system prepared to purge the remaining air. Thor's ears suddenly pinned back, his body going rigid under Ethan's hand. He wasn't looking at the gas or the vent anymore. His nose moved toward the gap beneath the heavy steel blast door, his hackles rising with a ferocity that made his previous aggression look like play. From the other side of that door, Ethan heard something that his military ears knew all too well, the muffled, synchronized footsteps of a tactical team moving in a diamond formation. These weren't the clumsy steps of shelter staff. These were professionals. And as a small fiber-optic camera lens began to snake its way through the bottom seal of the door, Ethan realized the leak hadn't been a malfunction at all. It was a flushing operation. Thor let out a low, vibrating growl, but this time his head stayed pressed against Ethan's leg, his eyes fixed on the door as a small metallic object was slid through the gap. It wasn't a gas mask or a rescue tool. It was a localized jamming device, and as it hummed to life, every emergency light in the hallway died, plunging the room into a darkness that even Ethan felt like a physical weight. Thor nudged Ethan's pocket, his teeth snagging on the M18 smoke grenade Ethan had retrieved earlier. The dog wasn't just asking for a way out, he was asking for cover. Because as the magnetic locks on the blast door began to hiss in a way they weren't designed to, Ethan realized that someone didn't want the dangerous dog or the blind veteran to ever leave this hallway alive. The darkness that followed the jamming device was absolute, a void so thick it felt like the floor had dropped away from beneath Ethan's boots. For Ethan, the world didn't change visually, but the sensory landscape shifted violently. The high-pitched whine of the electronic jammer cut through his equilibrium, a jagged frequency designed to scramble civilian communication and disorient anyone trapped in the zone. Across the threshold of Kennel 4, Thor was no longer whining. The dog had transitioned into a state of high-alert readiness, his breathing deep and rhythmic, a living weapon waiting for the safety to be clicked off. "Ethan, we're locked out. The override isn't responding." Karen's voice came from the other side of the thick, observation glass, muffled and distant. He could hear the frantic tapping of fingers on a touchscreen and the desperate rattling of a door handle. The yellow-shirt staff, once the masters of this domain with their tranquilizer poles and clipboards, were now nothing more than spectators to a brewing catastrophe. Miller's voice, usually booming with authority, was reduced to a panicked whisper that Ethan's veteran ears picked up through the vents. "The system is hard-coded. If the sensors detect a level 4 biohazard, it purges the oxygen in 3 minutes. We can't get him out, Karen. The manual release is dead." Ethan felt the vibration of the facility's heavy-duty industrial blowers as they began to reverse, a standard procedure for a 2026 high-security containment wing. They weren't just filtering the air anymore, they were starving the room. The greenish fluoroketone gas was being sucked upward, but the oxygen was going with it. The pressure in the hallway began to drop, making Ethan's ears pop and his chest tighten with the first pangs of hypoxia. "Karen, listen to me," Ethan shouted, his voice echoing in the hollow metal hallway. "This isn't a malfunction. Someone bypassed your local server. Tell Miller to get away from that door." But it was too late. From the other side of the blast door, a muffled thump signaled the placement of a breaching charge, specifically a linear-shaped charge, the kind used by tactical units to slice through reinforced steel like hot wire through wax. Whoever was on the other side wasn't coming in with a key, they were coming in with a demolition plan. Thor's hackles were like stiff needles against Ethan's hand. The dog's internal compass, honed by years of elite K9 training, had identified the threat long before the humans. Thor moved with a sudden, fluid grace, his teeth snagging the strap of Ethan's M65 jacket and pulling him toward the shadow of a heavy, steel-topped grooming table. It was standard cover protocol, something Thor would have done for Officer Vance 1,000 times during live-fire drills. "He knows," Ethan whispered, his hand finding the cool metal of the table. "He knows they aren't here to rescue us." The staff behind the glass were paralyzed. Ethan could hear Karen sobbing, the sound of a woman who had spent her life trying to save animals only to realize she was now watching a slaughter. They were powerless, their civilian training useless against a professional-grade containment and eliminate scenario. Miller was still shouting about the liability insurance and the fire marshal, his voice a frantic chirp against the looming roar of the breach. Ethan reached into his pocket and felt the cold, textured surface of the M18 smoke grenade. In a world of high-tech jammers and thermal imaging, smoke was an old-school equalizer. He felt Thor's muzzle press against his wrist, a silent nudge. The dog wasn't just hiding, he was positioning himself for an interdiction. He was a patrol dog who had spent his career neutralizing the threat, and the scent of the men on the other side of that door, the scent of gun oil, Cordura nylon, and professional-grade sweat, had triggered a reflex that 2 years of isolation couldn't erase. The air grew thinner, the silence in the hallway becoming a physical weight. Then a low, electronic hum signaled the final countdown of the breaching charge. Ethan's thumb hooked into the pull ring of the M18. He couldn't see the sparks, but he felt the sudden surge of heat as the thermite in the charge began to eat through the steel. As the first sliver of the door began to glow red-hot, Thor didn't retreat. He stepped into the center of the hallway, his body perfectly centered, his weight shifted onto his forepaws. He wasn't barking. He was waiting for the light. But as the door began to buckle inward, a sound came from the vent above them, not the hiss of gas, but the unmistakable metallic clink of a flashbang canister bouncing off the floor tiles. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the tactical team wasn't just coming through the door, they were already in the ceiling. The most dangerous retired police dog ever recorded was about to face a flash blindness he couldn't survive, unless the blind man holding his collar knew exactly when to pull the pin. The world shattered into 1,000 shards of white noise and pressure. The M84 flashbang detonated with a 170 decibel roar, a wave of concussive force that would have rendered any sighted man useless, his retinas scorched by the 6 million candle power flare. But Ethan Walker didn't blink. He lived in the dark, and in this void the explosion was merely a change in air pressure. Beside him, however, Thor let out a sharp, pained yelp, the dog's hypersensitive ears and predatory eyes taking the full brunt of the tactical assault. "Thor, eyes down," Ethan roared, his voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. He threw his weight over the dog, shielding the animal's head with the heavy canvas of his M65 jacket. The 3-ton blast door finally succumbed to the linear-shaped charge, the steel groaning as it buckled inward, spilling a harsh, artificial light into the smoke-filled corridor. Ethan could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of tactical boots, Loa Zephyrsol striking the linoleum in a deliberate, aggressive stride. The team was moving in, suppressed SIG MCX Rattlers raised to low ready. They weren't there for a rescue, they were clearing a contaminated asset. Under the jacket, Thor was vibrating, a low, tectonic growl starting in his chest. The flashbang had disoriented him, but the smell of the breach, the ozone, the burnt steel, and the unmistakable scent of intruder was an override code for his training. Ethan felt the dog's muscles bunching like steel cables. Thor wasn't looking for a way to hide anymore. He was reverting to his elite apprehension programming, the same lethal focus he'd used to protect Officer Vance in the line of duty. "Handler down," a cold, synthesized voice crackled over a tactical radio near the door. "Targeting the K9. Neutralize on sight." Ethan's fingers found the latch of the heavy-duty kennel door. It was warped from the heat of the breach, the galvanized steel hot to the touch. Thor didn't wait for the metal to clear. Sensing the threat closing within 20 feet, the dog slammed his 90-pound frame against the gate with the force of a battering ram. The lock groaned but held. "Break it, Thor." "Breaching maneuver," Ethan commanded, using the sharp, guttural German Schutzhund cues he'd heard the K9 handlers use at Bugram. Thor let out a sound that was less of a bark and more of a primal scream. He didn't just hit the door. He used his powerful jaws to seize the horizontal bar near the latch, using his entire body weight as a lever. It was a move no standard service dog would ever attempt. A destructive breach, taught only to K9s meant for high-risk warrants. With a sickening crack of shearing metal, the latch plate gave way. Thor exploded from the cage, but he didn't run for the exit. He circled back to Ethan in a tight, protective arc, his teeth snagging Ethan's belt to haul the veteran to his feet. The dog's vision was still swimming with spots from the flashbang, but his nose was locked onto the three men in shadow gray tactical gear entering the hall. Ethan pulled the pin on the M18 smoke grenade. He didn't throw it, he dropped it at his feet. A thick, opaque cloud of violet smoke began to billow, masking their heat signatures and confusing the tactical team's night vision goggles. "Go!" Ethan hissed, his hand gripping Thor's tactical collar. The dog didn't hesitate. He became a blur of black and tan, moving through the smoke with a silent, predatory gait. He wasn't just leading a blind man, he was hunting. As the first tactical shooter raised his weapon toward a movement in the mist, Thor didn't go for the leg. He launched himself through the air, aiming for the high center mass, the apprehension strike designed to take down an armed combatant in seconds. The sound of the man's muffled scream and the clatter of his rifle hitting the floor told Ethan the first strike had landed. But as Ethan followed the sound of the struggle, his hand brushing the cold wall, he felt a sudden, sharp vibration through the floor. It wasn't more footsteps. It was the sound of a heavy secondary security gate, the one leading to the only clean air exit, locking with a permanent, electronic finality. Thor returned to Ethan's side, his breathing ragged, his muzzle wet with something that wasn't water. The dog nudged Ethan's hand, pulling him toward the back of the hallway, away from the fallen shooter. Ethan's fingers brushed the man's tactical vest as they passed, and his heart skipped a beat as he felt a familiar cold texture tucked into a maul webbing loop. It wasn't a weapon. It was a specialized biometric override key, but as Ethan's fingers closed around it, he realized the key was covered in a strange, viscous liquid that was starting to burn his skin, a substance that shouldn't exist in a K9 rehab center, and one that suggested the dog wasn't the only thing being tested in this building. The violet smoke from the M18 grenade had turned the hallway into a thick, opaque soup, a tactical wideout that rendered the high-end GPN VG-18 panoramic night vision goggles of the remaining intruders useless. In this world of swirling haze and chemical shadows, the tactical advantage had shifted. Ethan Walker, a man who had lived in total darkness for 3 years, was the only one in the room who didn't feel blind. But he was still a man in a maze, and the floor was a minefield of fallen equipment, slick fluoroketone residue, and the silent, invisible threats of a building that had turned on its inhabitants. Thor's breathing was a steady, rhythmic rasp at Ethan's knee. The dog had finished his interdiction of the first shooter and had returned to his primary directive, protection. He didn't just stand by Ethan. He leaned his weight against Ethan's left leg, a pressure guide technique used by elite K9 handlers to communicate direction without sound. Ethan's hand stayed locked on the dog's tactical collar, feeling every ripple of muscle, every twitch of Thor's ears. "Lead, Thor. Find the clean air," Ethan whispered. Thor didn't move toward the main blast door where the tactical team was regrouping. Instead, he steered Ethan toward the center of the corridor. The dog's head was low, his nose working at a frantic frequency. Suddenly, Thor's body went rigid. He didn't bark. He simply stopped and pushed his shoulder firmly against Ethan's shin, forcing him to halt mid-step. Ethan reached down, his fingers sweeping the air in front of his boots. Just 6 inches ahead, his knuckles brushed against a thin, vibrating wire. It was a PIR, passive infrared, tripwire, rigged to a secondary set of ceiling-mounted suppressant canisters. If he had taken one more step, they would have been doused in a fresh wave of concentrated chemicals. Thor hadn't seen the wire in the smoke. He had smelled the faint ozone of the electronic trigger and the distinct, metallic scent of the copper wiring. "Good boy," Ethan breathed, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. They moved in a jagged, serpentine pattern, a dance of survival choreographed by a dog's nose. Thor guided him over the tangled remains of a capture pole and around the unconscious form of the first shooter. The dog was acting as Ethan's eyes, but he was doing more than that. He was processing a three-dimensional map of threats. He could hear the high-pitched coil whine of the tactical team's radios and the metallic clink of a flashbang being readied for a second toss. The air was growing thinner, the oxygen levels in the red zone, reaching a critical threshold. Ethan's head was swimming, the first signs of hypoxia clouding his judgment. He felt Thor's grip on his sleeve tighten, the dog pulling him with renewed urgency toward the maintenance crawlspace they had bypassed earlier. The dog knew that the main exits were compromised, and the secondary gate was locked with a biometric seal that required a clearance Ethan didn't have. As they reached the jagged opening behind the equipment locker, Thor didn't push Ethan toward the vent. He stopped at a heavy, reinforced floor grate, a drainage system for the facility's washdown area. The dog began to dig at the iron mesh, his claws throwing sparks. Beneath the grate, Ethan could hear the faint, hollow echo of running water. It was a secondary egress, a path through the subflooring that wouldn't be monitored by the building's security AI. Down there? Ethan asked, his fingers finding the heavy latch of the grate. Thor let out a sharp, affirmative huff. But as Ethan prepared to heave the iron mesh upward, the sound of a suppressed 5.56 mm burst shattered the silence. The bullets chewed into the drywall inches above Ethan's head, sending a spray of gypsum dust into his face. The tactical team had switched to thermal imaging, and they had found a heat signature through the thinning smoke. Ethan pulled the biometric override key he had taken from the shooter, his fingers tracing the viscous, burning liquid still coating the metal. As he jammed the key into the grate's electronic maintenance port, a small LED he couldn't see flickered from red to green. The grate hissed open, revealing a vertical drop into the service tunnels. Thor didn't hesitate. He leapt into the dark first, his 90-pound frame disappearing into the hole with the silent grace of a predator. Ethan followed, sliding into the damp, narrow concrete throat of the facility's underbelly. As the grate slammed shut above them, plunging them into a secondary darkness, the sound of the tactical team's boots echoed directly overhead. But as Ethan reached out to find Thor in the tunnel, his hand didn't meet fur. Instead, his fingers brushed against a smooth, cold surface that shouldn't have been in a drainage pipe. It was a row of airtight, pressurized canisters, and as Ethan's heightened sense of smell picked up a new, terrifyingly familiar scent, the scent of VX nerve agent precursors, he realized that Thor hadn't led him to a drain. He had led him into the heart of a clandestine laboratory that the K9 Rehabilitation Center was built to hide, and the reason Thor had been slated for permanent isolation was because he was the only witness left who could smell the truth. The damp, clinical chill of the service tunnels felt a world away as the morning sun of late January 2026 finally bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the facility's main atrium. The lockdown crisis, officially recorded as a catastrophic HVAC failure and security breach by a rogue private contractor, had left the building scarred. Blackened scorch marks still stained the floor where the linear-shaped charges had eaten through the steel, and the faint, sweet scent of neutralizing agents lingered in the air. But for Ethan Walker, the atmosphere had never been clearer. Standing in the center of the lobby, Ethan adjusted the collar of his M65 field jacket. Beside him, Thor sat with a military precision that silenced the room. The dog was no longer the snarling monster of Kennel 4. He was a guardian in repose, his ears flicking toward every footstep, his weight leaning firmly against Ethan's thigh in a silent declaration of ownership. The yellow-shirt staff kept their distance, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and lingering unease. They had watched on the grainy, flickering backup monitors as a blind man and a broken dog navigated a chemical tomb, outmaneuvering a tactical team that officially didn't exist. Karen approached them, her footsteps hesitant. She carried a thick manila folder, the legal tether that would either bind these two warriors together or tear them apart. The board of directors met this morning, she began, her voice still raspy from the gas. After what happened, after seeing the footage of Thor's restraint and his protective focus during the breach, there was no longer a debate about his unpredictability. She paused, looking down at the German shepherd. Thor looked back, his amber eyes calm, the frantic, grieving light that had occupied them for years finally extinguished. He had found a heartbeat that matched his own. The adoption is finalized, Karen said, her voice softening. He's yours, Ethan. Officially, he's been reclassified as a specialized service animal under the Veterans Assistance Program. But we all know he's more than that. Ethan reached down, his hand unerringly finding the top of Thor's head. The dog leaned into the touch, a low, contented rumble vibrating in his chest. He's not a service animal, Karen, Ethan said quietly. He's a brother in arms. He didn't just lead me out of that hallway. He showed me that I'm still a soldier even if the battlefield has changed. The director of the facility, a man who had previously signed Thor's euthanasia order, stepped forward. He didn't offer a handshake. He knew Ethan couldn't see it, but he snapped to attention, his heels clicking together in a sharp, professional salute that echoed through the quiet atrium. It was a salute for two veterans who had survived a war that followed them home. "Sergeant Walker," the director said, his voice thick with uncharacteristic respect. "The transport is waiting. We've cleared all your paperwork and we've included a full tactical kit, harness, lead and the tracking units. You two have a new mission." Ethan nodded, the red grip of his white cane feeling redundant now. He didn't need the tap-tap-tap of the carbon fiber to find the door. He felt the shift in Thor's muscles, the dog's subtle nudge toward the exit. Together, they moved with a synchronized rhythm that no standard guide dog could ever replicate. It was a tactical glide, two survivors of the same darkness moving as a single unified organism. As they reached the heavy glass doors leading to the outside world, Ethan felt the warmth of the sun on his face for the first time in what felt like decades. He wasn't just walking into a new day, he was walking into a life where the shadows no longer held fear, because he had a partner who could see through the dark. But as they stepped onto the sidewalk, Thor suddenly halted. The dog's body went rigid, his nose twitching as he caught a scent on the morning breeze, a scent that didn't belong in the suburban quiet of the K9 Center. It was the smell of Grade A jet fuel, JP-8, and the distinct, metallic ozone of a high-altitude surveillance drone. Ethan felt a cold shiver trace his spine as he heard the faint, distant hum of a turbine overhead. The facility's dark secret hadn't been buried with the gas. It had followed them out the door, and as Thor's low growl returned, Ethan realized that their adoption wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a hunt that would take them far beyond the city limits. Ethan and Thor were discarded because they were broken. They were invisible to a world that only values what's perfect. If you believe that scars don't decrease a hero's value, then prove it. Don't just watch, act. Hitting that subscribe button is the only way we can keep telling the stories of the brave souls the system wants to bury. Like this if you've ever felt like an underdog, and comment your country to show Ethan and Thor that they have an army of supporters standing behind them today. Don't let them stand alone.